In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row.
Yeah, it's arguably one of the most famous openings to any piece of literature in the 20th century. Those lines just carry a very specific heavy weight for anyone who hears them.
Absolutely. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we have a really fascinating journey laid out for you. We are looking at a comprehensive Wikipedia biography of a man whose words you have almost certainly heard, probably on a crisp November morning while pinning a red paper flower to your lapel.
Right, the Remembrance poppy.
Exactly. But while you likely know the poem, you probably don't know the incredible and frankly deeply contradictory life of the man who actually wrote it, John McCrae.
The poem itself has become so monumental, so ingrained in our global culture of remembrance, that it has almost entirely eclipsed the human being holding the pen.
Yeah.
And when you actually look at the source material of his life, you realize what a profoundly complex human being he was.
That is exactly our mission for you today. We are going to look right past the heavy mythology of those famous verses to uncover the real John McCrae. Because we are talking about a man who was simultaneously a brilliant life-saving healer, a fiercely dedicated soldier, and a completely reluctant literary icon.
He really didn't set out to be a famous poet.
No, not at all. Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you really want a shortcut to being well-informed about a historical legend, you have to start at the beginning, long before the battlefields of Europe.
Right. So we find ourselves in Guelph, Ontario in the year 1872. That's when McCrae is born to Scottish immigrants. And the biography notes that his father was a veteran of the Fenian raids and a prominent local figure.
Yeah, and right away we see the first major tension in his life between his ambition and his physical reality. But before we get into that tension, I want to clarify something for you, the listener.
The Fenian raids.
Yeah, the source mentions the Fenian raids in passing, but that is a piece of history that usually gets glossed over. The Fenians were essentially an Irish Republican organization based in the United States. And in the mid to late 19th century, they actually launched armed incursions into Canadian territory.
Which sounds wild today.
Right. They were trying to hold Canada hostage to force Britain to leave Ireland. So McCrae's father wasn't just a guy who liked wearing a uniform. He had actively defended his local community against literal cross-border invasions.
That establishes a very real, deeply ingrained military pedigree in that household from day one.
Completely.
And that context is vital because it sets up the expectations placed on young John. He was incredibly driven. I mean, he was the very first student from Guelph to win a scholarship to the University of Toronto.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a young man in a hurry, completely dedicated to his studies. But his body simply wouldn't cooperate. Our source notes that despite this immense drive, he suffered from severe lifelong asthma.
Oh.
In fact, it was so debilitating that he was forced to take an entire year off from his university studies just to recover.
I think we really need to pause and think about what a year off for asthma meant in the 1890s. Because today, if you have an asthma attack, you just reach for a rescue inhaler.
Exactly, it's manageable.
But back then, medical treatments for respiratory failure were primitive and honestly often brutal. They didn't have corticosteroids. Treatment sometimes involved inhaling the fumes of burning powders, taking heavy sedatives, or just sitting upright in a chair for days on end, fighting for every single breath.
Agonizing.
To be forced out of university for a year meant he was likely completely incapacitated. This wasn't a childhood ailment he just outgrew. This respiratory vulnerability would haunt him and actively threaten his life until the day he died.
Yet he pushes through. He returns to school, finishes his BA, and then pivots to medicine. And his medical career was nothing short of meteoric. To help pay his own medical school tuition, he actually tutored other students.
Right.
And there's a detail in this source that really speaks to his character. 2 of the students he tutored went on to become among the first female doctors in Ontario.
See, that is a detail that really stands out to me. The 1890s medical establishment was notoriously hostile to women. For McCrae to actively tutor female medical students shows a level of progressivism and dedication to the craft of medicine itself, completely regardless of the gender politics of the era.
He is focused purely on excellence. He graduates in 1898, and from there, his resume reads like a who's who of elite medical institutions.
Where does he go?
Well, he works at Toronto General Hospital. He heads down to Maryland to work at the prestigious Johns Hopkins Hospital, where his brother Thomas was already a professor of medicine.
Okay.
He goes to the University of Vermont, where he is appointed a professor of pathology. He teaches at McGill University in Montreal. He becomes a resident pathologist at Montreal General Hospital, then moves to the Royal Victoria Hospital.
He is everywhere.
He even crosses the Atlantic to study in England, becoming a member of the Royal College of Physicians.
How does someone with a respiratory system that actively tries to shut down on him manage that kind of relentless, grueling schedule? He isn't just surviving, he is bouncing between countries, establishing himself at the absolute pinnacle of Edwardian medicine.
He even co-authored a college pathology textbook in 1912.
Right. So you naturally picture a man deeply embedded in the dusty world of science, a very stern, maybe sepia-toned academic.
Which brings us to another contradiction, because he wasn't that dusty academic at all. He was incredibly vibrant. The source shares an amazing anecdote from 1910.
Oh, the canoe trip.
Yes. He goes on a canoe trip to Hudson Bay, serving as the expedition physician for Lord Grey, who was the Governor-General of Canada at the time.
A 3,000-mile canoe trip into the Canadian wilderness. That is an arduous journey even for a completely healthy person, let alone someone with severe asthma.
And Lord Grey later wrote to McCrae, marveling at his company. Grey said, and I quote, "I believe the 3,000 miles of our travels were illumined by as many stories."
I love that quote.
It tells you exactly why this matters. McCrae wasn't a somber, detached figure brooding over life and death. He was a highly social, witty storyteller. He was charming, he was an adventurer, and he was deeply respected as a pillar of society long before the dark clouds of war ever gathered over Europe.
It's wild to think of him telling stories around a campfire with the Governor-General, because there's this entirely different, much darker side to McCrae that was developing at the exact same time, a deep-seated obsession with the military.
Yeah.
Which runs completely at odds with his oath as a doctor to do no harm.
And it started remarkably early. Remember that military pedigree from his father we talked about?
The Fenian Raids guy?
Right. The source notes his father organized and commanded the Guelph Field Artillery. So at just 14 years old, young John McCrae joins his father's unit as a bugler. 14.
That's practically a child.
And he wasn't just playing at being a soldier. He won a prize as the best cadet in Ontario.
And it wasn't just parade ground stuff either. In 1899, he volunteers for active service in the Second Boer War in South Africa. Now, for you listening who might not be familiar, the Boer War was a brutal, grueling conflict between the British Empire and the Boer republics in southern Africa.
Very harsh conditions.
Extremely. It was characterized by guerrilla warfare and widespread disease. McCrae is out there as a lieutenant in the Canadian Field Artillery, fighting in skirmishes across the Orange Free State and the Transvaal.
He even earns the Queen's South Africa Medal with 3 clasps.
Wow.
Those clasps represent participation in specific major operations or campaigns. So he was a deeply seasoned combat veteran before the 20th century had barely even started. He eventually rose to the rank of major in the artillery before stepping back into the reserve in 1904 to focus on that meteoric medical career we just discussed.
Which brings us to the First World War. It's 1914. Britain declares war on Germany, which automatically means Canada is at war too. Put yourself in those shoes for a second. McCrae is 41 years old. He has a thriving, prestigious medical practice. He has severe asthma. He could have easily sat this one out. No one would have questioned his bravery. He already had a medal from South Africa. But he volunteers anyway.
He does.
And he wrote a letter to a friend explaining why. And the quote from our source is just incredibly powerful. He wrote, "I'm really rather afraid, but more afraid to stay at home with my conscience."
What's fascinating here is the profound sense of duty that single sentence reveals. You really have to sit with that. He is admitting fear, which is a deeply human, rational response to industrialized warfare. But his moral compass, his perceived obligation to his countrymen, simply overrides his instinct for self-preservation.
It's incredible.
He was an established middle-aged man, yet he felt morally compelled to plunge back into the horrors of combat.
Now, with a medical resume like that, he obviously went straight into the medical corps, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the military must have seen a brilliant pathologist and immediately put him in a hospital.
Actually, no. He fought to stay with the guns. Yeah, he is appointed as medical officer and major of the 1st Brigade, Canadian Field Artillery. He wanted to be on the front lines with the artillerymen. And a year later, in 1915, when he is officially ordered to leave the artillery and take command of a medical hospital, he is absolutely furious.
So he vents to his friend, CLC Allenson. He tells him exactly what he thinks about being pulled away from his beloved guns to go heal people. His exact words were, "Allenson, all the goddamn doctors in the world will not win this bloody war. What we need is more and more fighting men."
It's a jarring quote. To hear the author of a poem of such tender mourning speaking with such aggressive martial frustration really highlights the internal conflict of the man.
It really does.
He was one of the greatest medical minds of his generation, resentful that he was forced to save lives when he felt his duty was to fight.
Speaking of his internal life, the source does touch briefly on his private life, which he kept very guarded. He wrote weekly letters to his mother, and he did propose to his sister-in-law, Nona Gwyn, but was refused.
Right. And as we look at his personal life, our source material mentions a modern debate that we should briefly cover. In 2011, a museum in Ottawa, the Bytown Museum, sparked some controversy by questioning his sexuality and suggesting he might have been gay.
And we want to be very clear with you, the listener, that we are just imparting what is in the source material here.
Yeah.
We aren't endorsing any specific viewpoints or taking sides in this historical debate. We are simply reporting on the contents of the Wikipedia biography.
Exactly. To provide the full context from that source, it neutrally notes that the museum's own director of development later distanced himself from the theory. Furthermore, McCrae biographers and the curator of the McCrae House state that there is absolutely no historical evidence that McCrae was gay. So it remains a point of modern contention, but not one supported by the primary biographers.
Let's shift our focus back to the battlefields of Europe, because this is where his life reaches its tragic, defining crescendo. It is 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres.
This is a crucible. The Second Battle of Ypres is infamous for being the first mass use of poison gas on the Western Front. The conditions described in the source are visceral. McCrae is treating the wounded from a hastily dug 8 by 8 foot bunker.
Measure that out in your mind. 8 feet by 8 feet. That is the size of a small walk-in closet.
It's tiny.
And this bunker is carved right into the dirt of a dike along the Yser Canal, just a couple of miles north of Ypres. This former university professor, this man who canoed with the governor general, is now crammed into a tiny, muddy hole in the earth, desperately trying to patch up catastrophically broken soldiers as the world literally explodes around her.
The conditions must have been horrific.
The noise, the blood, the sheer terror of it. And remember, he is doing this while his own lungs are compromised by severe asthma.
It was during this relentless sensory nightmare that the catalyst for his immortal poem occurred. A close friend of McCrae's and a former militia member, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, was killed in the battle.
Helmer was buried in a makeshift grave, just a simple wooden cross. And it was the very next day, May 3rd, 1915, that McCrae found himself sitting on the back of a medical field ambulance near an advanced dressing post at Essex Farm.
He was looking out at the spoiled earth of the battlefields and the fresh cemeteries of Flanders. The artillery had churned up the soil, which actually brings poppy seeds to the surface and exposes them to light.
That's fascinating.
So despite the utter devastation, nature was stubbornly asserting itself. Wild, blood-red poppies were already beginning to bloom in great numbers between the crosses that marked the graves.
There, on the back of that ambulance, processing the raw grief of losing his friend, the artilleryman, who hated being a doctor, wrote in Flanders Fields.
The poem itself is classified as a threnody. It's a specific genre of lament, a poem of mourning. But what makes it so striking is that it's written from the perspective of the dead themselves.
Right.
We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow. It forces the reader into an immediate, unbreakable intimacy with the fallen. You aren't just observing their sacrifice. They're speaking directly to you.
The journey of that poem into the public consciousness is fascinating. It was published anonymously later that year in December 1915 in a British magazine called Punch, and it just exploded. It became swiftly, wildly popular all over the world.
Its impact was immediate and staggering. It was translated into multiple languages. There's even a Latin version that begins in Agro Belgico. It was used in countless fundraising campaigns to support the war effort. The emotional resonance was universal.
You have to wonder how a private, reserved guy handles sudden global fame.
Yeah, how did he react?
Apparently he was mostly just amused by the incompetence of the publishers, because even though he was suddenly a household name, they misspelled his name as McCrae in the magazine's index.
Oh, that's frustrating.
He joked to friends that he just wished they would get to printing his name correctly. But ultimately, his biographer notes, he was satisfied if the poem enabled men to see where their duty lay.
Duty was always his North Star. He kept working, even as his own health began to fail him drastically.
That brings us to his final years, which sound absolutely agonizing. From June 1915 onward, he was commanding No. 3 Canadian General Hospital near Boulogne-sur-Mer in France. For 8 months, this hospital operated out of durbar tents.
A durbar tent is a massive, ornate canvas structure traditionally used by Indian royalty for large gatherings or courts. The source notes these specific tents were donated by the Begum of Bhopal, who was a female Muslim ruler of a princely state in India, to support the British war effort.
It's a generous donation, but think about the practical reality of it. These are tents designed for the blazing heat of India to allow maximum airflow. Now they are pitched in the freezing, rainy mud of northern France. The medical staff and the patients suffered through terrible storms, massive floods, and biting frosts before finally being moved into an old Jesuit college. You have to imagine what that damp, freezing environment was doing to a man who had suffered from severe asthma his entire life.
It was a recipe for disaster. His immune system was undoubtedly compromised by the stress, the environment, and his chronic condition. Tragically, his body simply gave out. On January 28, 1918, while still commanding the hospital, John McCrae died. He was 45 years old.
The source states the cause of death was pneumonia, complicated by extensive pneumococcus meningitis. For you listening, pneumococcus meningitis is an infection that spreads to the lining of the brain and spinal cord.
Which is brutal.
Before the invention of modern antibiotics, it was an agonizing, terrifying way to die. He suffered immensely at the end, and he didn't even live to see the armistice.
He was buried the very next day in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission section of Wimereux Cemetery, just up the coast from Boulogne.
The details of his funeral provided in the source are so deeply moving. He was buried with full military honors. His coffin was draped in a flag and borne on a gun carriage. The mourners included General Sir Arthur Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps, along with many of McCrae's friends and hospital staff.
The detail that really lingers is about his horse. His beloved charger, named Bonfire, who had been with him all the way from Quebec.
Yeah.
Bonfire led the funeral procession. And in a traditional military symbol of fallen cavalry, McCrae's boots were placed reversed in the stirrups. The riderless horse is one of the most poignant symbols of military loss.
If you go to Wimereux Cemetery today, you'll see a unique detail about his resting place. His gravestone is placed completely flat on the ground. All the stones in that section are flat, actually, because the sandy soil near the coast is too unstable to hold them upright.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the legacy he left behind is almost unfathomable for a man who died so relatively young. Beyond the poem, his medical contributions are still honored. The Canadian Medical Association awards the John McCrae Memorial Medal to health services members of the Canadian Armed Forces for exemplary service.
He was designated a person of national historic significance in Canada. There are statues of him in Ottawa and in his hometown of Guelph. There are schools named after him. There's even a Mount McCrae in British Columbia.
In Ypres, Belgium, right near the muddy dike where the history happened, the Cloth Hall houses a permanent war museum named the Flanders Fields Museum.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking for the man behind the myth. We found a brilliantly educated doctor who helped women break into medicine when few others would. We found a man who could charm a governor general on a 3,000-mile canoe trip.
Absolutely.
We found a fiercely proud artilleryman who survived the Boer War and who later hated the fact that he was ordered to save lives instead of take them.
And we found a man sitting on the back of an ambulance, exhausted, grieving his friend, surrounded by the absolute worst of human destruction, who somehow noticed the resilient beauty of a flower. And in doing so, he permanently cemented the red poppy as the universal symbol of remembrance.
It is a staggering legacy, a complex tapestry of a life. Thank you for walking through it with us. But before we officially sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. Our source mentions that In Flanders Fields was printed extensively in the United States at a time when the U.S. government was still just contemplating joining the war, and it was often printed alongside a reply poem written by an American named R.W. Lillard. You see, the closing lines of McCrae's poem are a challenge to the living. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high.
It's a call to action.
Exactly, and Lillard's reply poem answered that challenge directly across the border. He wrote, "Fear not that you have died for naught, the torch ye threw to us we caught. In our modern era, an era defined by constant information overload and sadly ongoing global conflicts, what does it truly mean for us, the readers of today, to catch the torch?
That's the real question.
How do we keep faith with those who have died? Beyond just wearing a paper poppy once a year, McCrae challenged his readers not to let the dead sleep in vain. How are we answering him today?" Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary, contradictory life of John McCrae. We hope you walk away not just well-informed, but inspired to look a little closer at the history all around us. Until next time.